Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. And so today, the first Sunday after Easter, we are in the story of the road to Emmaus. This is in the 24th chapter of Luke, picking up in verse 13. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And Jesus said to them, "What things?" And they said, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning. And when they did not find his body, they came back saying they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Yet some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11, and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of bread. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our household, we had a great Easter, and our house is still overflowing with Easter candy. When we left our house last Sunday morning to head to church, the kids found chocolate bunnies in their lockers just on the way out the door. And they interpreted these as signs that the Easter bunny had come. And not having enough time to leave eggs in the yard, would return later. And so on the way home, the kids were wondering, right? They had hoped that such a thing might happen, but they weren't certain. And so when they got home, we pulled in the driveway, there was this audible gasp when the kids saw the eggs in the backyard. They had hoped, and they were not disappointed. For indeed, the Easter bunny had come, and there was more candy to be discovered. Our two disciples, Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple, are in a not dissimilar situation. They have seen signs that had encouraged them to hope that Jesus was the Messiah. And these disciples are not casual followers of Jesus. They're clearly committed to the ministry of Jesus, right? They lingered in Jerusalem for a few days after Jesus was crucified. And they were spending time in the inner circle, right? Apparently, it sounds like they're some of the first to hear the reports of the women who came back from the empty tomb and were telling the disciples what they had seen. And they had heard enough, right, too, that some of the people went to investigate. They didn't see Jesus and came back. And so at that point, right, Cleopas and this other disciple, they made the decision to return home to Emmaus. And they meet this stranger. And they're telling him what they had hoped for, what they had previously hoped that Jesus would turn out to be, but those hopes were disappointed. They didn't discover a yard full of Easter eggs on their return, and they found only disappointment. right? How many of you have ever been in a place like that where you had hoped for something and it didn't materialize, right? It's funny, when I was graduating from seminary, this was back in 2007, I was having a hard time finding a good match to begin my ministry career. And there was actually a church here in Columbus that will remain unnamed that I was interviewing with and talking to, and they were moving slowly as the Presbyterian process did. And there was this point into the interview process where we got this sort of cryptic message saying, hey, we think you're going to receive good news soon. And so Rachel and I interpreted this like a normal person would, and we sort of started planning our life in Columbus. And we were a city, we didn't know anything about this mysterious and exotic city. And we, we're sort of fully invested in this because we had this great hope of what life was going to look like. And then suddenly one day out of the blue, I get this packet in the mail with all the materials I had submitted to them in this sort of generic rejection letter. And it was just pure disappointment. And the hopes that we had were shattered. I can't say that I handled this particularly well. I had hoped things would work out, and they did not. It's funny to think now, 15 years later, here we are in Columbus. My ministry career has certainly gone different than I might have expected. And life has a way of surprising us, right? But there was a window where I exactly shared the sentiments of these disciples. Right? We had hoped, but then there was evidence to the contrary, and so we gave up on those hopes. Right? You know this place. We all know this place. Right? Where you're expecting good things to occur. You have hopes for something. They don't turn out the way you want them to for one reason or another. Maybe you're still there. Maybe you still have questions. Maybe you're walking the road to Emmaus and you're filled with disappointment. Right, to each and every one of you, to each and every one of us, Christ shows up. Right, but it doesn't mean that all of your problems are immediately solved, that your disappointment goes away, right? Cleopas and the other disciple, they didn't even realize who was with them. They didn't realize that the solution for all of their disappointment was right there with them. They didn't know until they got to Emmaus, but Christ still shows up. Right, and this story, I think, perfectly encapsulates our lives in so many ways, and it's what I love about the Gospels, about the Scriptures, about this story in particular, right? At some point, these disciples were perfectly positioned, right? They're clearly followers of Jesus. They think he's the Messiah. They hope he's the Messiah. They're following him. They're surrounding themselves with the right people, right? Because, again, they're there when the women come back from the empty tomb. And they report that Jesus, there's an angel there telling them that Jesus has been raised. The body is not there. Right? They're right there at one of the most important moments in history. They've aligned themselves in the right ways. And then they left. They went home. Right? They were disappointed. They thought the story ended before it really ended. They were so close. And they gave up. It's like you read about these inventors who were so close to these groundbreaking inventions, but they gave up at just the wrong time, and then somebody else came along and did all the work. And these disciples, they're right there, and then the risen Jesus is with them, and they don't see it. And it's only later on, after they've been walking with Jesus, right, did they grasp the fullness of the gospel, and only then did they look back and have the ability to then make sense of everything, but only much, much later. Right? It's how life works sometimes, right? Jesus is promised to always be with us, to always abide with us. And you hear some of the Psalms, right? It's like, if I descend to the depths of the seas, you are there. Which is great for the psalmist to be able to say, but some of us just feel like we're descending to the depths, and we wonder, is Jesus there? We're like Cleopas on the walk. Right? We had hoped. Right? The core promise of the gospel is Jesus is there, but right, we get distracted. We get disappointed. Right? Even when we're surrounding ourselves with the right people and the right things, there's no formula, because we can get distracted by something else. And we end up disappointed. We don't understand how Jesus is with us. We're not certain that Jesus is with us. We go through these dark nights of the soul or these other disappointments. right? At some point, each and every one of us comes to the hardest thing, right? We face our own death, right? And we have all of these big questions about how and will Jesus be with us? And Scripture is telling us, right, there's so much more to the story. The Easter story, right, is one of Jesus conquering death. And we know that at some point we'll be able to look back and make sense of a lot of things. Right? Because I think there are some things that will only make sense after death, when we look back and we're in the fullness of God. We look back and we say, oh, I understand how that works. I understand why that happened. But it's so hard for that to happen now, right? Right? And it's how Cleopas, right? And he and his friend, when they got back to Emmaus and they'd broken bread and Jesus was there, and they go, oh, and they look back and they walk, oh, our hearts were burning within us. Now we understand. Now we understand the crucifixion. Right? Now we understand Holy Saturday. Now we understand. Now we get it. Right? Just because we don't recognize the presence of God in our midst doesn't mean that Jesus isn't there. Right? Even in the most disappointing parts of life, God is near and God abides even when we're not certain. And so the question, right, is how do we open our eyes? How do we help ourselves see Jesus in our midst? How do we avoid or try and avoid the deep disappointment of these disciples, right? Life is going to have these moments. But how do we try and avoid placing ourselves there? Is there anything we can do? And there's a few things, I think, from this story that help us see how God is at work. And the first is simply to be curious. There was a story the other day about a guy, and he's heading to Tulum, Mexico. And shortly before he went, he started digging into his family genealogy. His family has kept all these records that trace the family tree back. And what he discovered is that one of his ancestors, so he's going to Tulum and sort of on a lark, one of his ancestors was one of the first 2 Europeans to be at Tulum and wrote this book about it and helped the world understand what had gone on, the archaeological significance of what happened in Tulum. And I guess there are even like signs down there that talk about this, and there's a book. But he wouldn't have known this had he not had the curiosity to dig into his family genealogy. He would have been in this place where his ancestor was, and he never would have even known. And so, but it's only because of his curiosity that got him there. And the disciples here in the story, they completely fail this test, right? They follow Jesus for this time. They're in Jerusalem on Easter morning. They hear the reports of the women saying that the tomb is empty, that there was an angel there telling them that Christ is risen. They hear all this, and what do? They don't go look for themselves. They go home. They just leave. Right? It's so easy to think, oh, if we'd been alive back then, it'd be so much easier to be a Christian, but clearly not. Right? These disciples, they hear the proclamation from the first people that ever discover the tomb was empty. And they just leave. They never go look for themselves. All it took was a simple walk to the garden. But they leave, right? The Gospels invite you to be curious about your faith. Right? There's never been a time when so much information, too much information at times, it's overwhelming, but so much information is readily available from preachers and theologians and scholars to help you learn about the faith. Right? Any questions you have, right? From prayer resources, devotional resources, right? So much of it's free and it's delivered to the supercomputer that we carry in our pockets. Right? Remember when the internet first came out and like if you clicked on the wrong link and it started downloading a picture, you were stuck for half an hour? Right now you can download a whole book in seconds. You want to learn about your faith. Ask big questions, right? Don't be afraid of asking big questions, right? Be curious. I'm always happy to recommend resources for further study on any number of topics. Right? And the second thing, I think, be curious. The second thing is related to to be informed. Right? And it goes beyond knowing about Christianity, but it certainly starts there. Right? What does Jesus do when when the disciples don't recognize what has happened on Easter? Right? He doesn't offer them just this quick proof like he did for Thomas. No, it says he starts with Moses. He starts way back in the book of Exodus and walks them forward for hours about how everything in the Old Testament points to him. All of the prophets were talking about him. God has been preparing for the Messiah for hundreds of years. And Jesus starts with that because it matters. Because he talks about, this isn't a case where it's like, it's so common to think people will say, oh, I don't like the God of the Old Testament, but like the God of the New Testament, like the grace, not the judgment. And what Jesus does is says, no, it's one story. Jesus himself says it's all been building. It's the same God. It's the same story, right? He goes from tree to tree to tree, right? From the tree in the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve eat to the tree on the hill in Golgotha on Good Friday where Jesus is crucified, to the tree that has fruit for the healing of all the nations in Revelation. It's one story moving from tree to tree to tree. And you are in that story, right? It's part of the church being this eternal place that transcends time. That's part of our story. And so we need to be informed about our own story as we go out into the world and tell the story. And then also we have to know about the world's story, right? Because they meet right in the church. Because it matters what's going on in the church and it matters what's going on in the world. And so we talk to the world. And just to say, it's a complicated world out there. To even know what's going on, right? We hear the word disinformation sometimes and we know that it's there, but it's not clearly labeled, unfortunately. And so how do you figure out what's disinformation and what's not disinformation? How do you find, I like to be a person that knows both sides of the story, but sometimes it feels like it's hard just to know what the story is before you can even figure out the two sides of it, right? When you think about things going on internationally, things going on domestically, you're just trying to figure out the truth, and it's so hard. Who are the reliable sources for news? And I think one thing that we can do as Christians is to be skeptical, not overly cynical, but to be skeptical so that as we engage with the world, as we learn about the world, as we share information about the world, that we are as informed as we can be. And we're fallible in that. But I think the thing is also that how do we narrow our focus? We're learning about the world, but narrowing our focus to the things that we can impact, because it's so easy to get caught up, right, in things that we can't have an impact on. And so how do we be the most informed about the things we can impact while still learning and caring about the whole world, but thinking about how do we learn the most about things that we can impact? So that we're not just worried, because otherwise we can get in this state of worry, and we can worry endlessly, and then we stop enjoying the world, and we withdraw from fellowship, and then we're not engaged with the world. And it's so important to be engaged with the world, to be joyful, right? Because it is a world that we're called to enjoy, right? C.S. Lewis talked about the mere state of being worried is not in itself meritorious. We must, if it so happens, give our lives for others. But even while we're doing it, I think we're meant to enjoy our Lord and Him, and in Him our friends, our food, our sleep, our jokes, the bird's song and the frosty sunrise, right? We engage with the world, we enjoy the world, and we focus on the things that we can impact. So we're curious, we're informed, and then finally, it's our responsibility to continue to gather as a Christian community, to enjoy one another, and to worship, especially around the communion table, right? Jesus was revealed to these disciples in the breaking of bread, right? They'd had one of the most crushing disappointments of their lives, right? And Jesus had been teaching them for hours, but they didn't have the full hope of the gospel. Right? Even through all this teaching, they were still disappointed. There was a real physical need. And in the meeting of a physical need at the Lord's table, they realized who Jesus was and what was really true, and had changed their lives, right? In the same way, right, when we gather as a church, right, we're focused on meeting the physical needs of one another. But we cannot neglect the breaking of bread together, right? Because then Jesus' presence is revealed among us. And it animates us, it encourages us, it transforms us, and it sends us back out in the world, right? The disciples who had just walked 7 miles and it was evening, they said, hey, Jesus, you shouldn't go on because the day is almost done. No, they pack up and they head back to Jerusalem. They hurry back to tell the news because they're so excited, right? They were exhausted, but they were renewed by the good news of the gospel, right? Because of the nourishment, physical and spiritual, that they received at the table. they go back out into the world to tell the story. May the same be true of us this day and forevermore.